Hi people. So hopefully this little beam of light isn't too distracting. I have tried different angles but can't quite get rid of it. So hopefully it's not too distracting. Okay, so this one might be a little bit longer. There are a number of things I want to cover. And it's probably the domestic issue I feel strongest about, which is law and order, crime, justice, whatever you want the umbrella term to be. Um, Specifically on prisons. Um, I've just watched Starmer's first press conference, assumed from 10 Downing Street, and a number of issues came up. Um, how he was settling into the job, the mandate that he has, the NHS, all important issues. But one thing that came up a few times was the prisons issue. Now, there's no getting away from the fact that British prisons are overcrowded. In all four nations, they're overcrowded. We have the biggest prison population in Europe. This is something I've spoken about before, but it's such an important issue that it's worth reiterating. Now, the problem at the moment is the whole system is a mess, and it's this general sense of things. One reason the Tories lost that just nothing is working. The court's backlog causes a problem for everyone. It means that victims of crime have to wait for justice, sometimes up to years, which is a disgrace. It means that the accused also have to wait. They've got that hanging over them. And I say the accused because in some cases they may be cleared. That's also an issue. If you have someone who's been accused of something and they turn out to be innocent, that affects them as well. They've got that hanging over them. I'm just as sympathetic to people who suffer a miscarriage of justice as victims of crime. Um, so they've got that hanging over them. So this court's backlog thing, I- it's it's a pivotal issue in all of this. And actually, I probably haven't spoken about that enough. Um, but I want to address one thing that Starmer mentioned, or rather, the question was put to him. His new Prisons Minister James Timpson, who's known for the Timpson Key chain brand. That's Timpson Keys. I've got one myself. That's what he's known for. Apparently, he has a background in getting offenders to work in his tool shops and so on. And he wants to look at the Dutch model. Now, one thing that concerns me about what Timpson has said, according to him, only about a third of prisoners should definitely be there. A third? Really? Now, I'd like to know what sort of people he thinks shouldn't be in prison. Because this is one of the big misconceptions when we're talking about prison, that only violent crimes are somehow serious. If you get a con artist who has robbed a pensioner, or anyone for that matter, but particularly a vulnerable person, of their life savings or a very big portion of their savings, that is a destructive crime that can cause enormous distress and anguish and anxiety to the victim. It hasn't involved any physical violence. Now, should someone like that really avoid prison? Should they just be put on a community sentence? No. I think that sort of crime um, that may not involve violence should definitely be a prison sentence. I think almost every violent offence should be a mandatory custodial sentence. Because if you have a yob who assaults someone for no reason, the chances are they're going to do it again. If they feel the confidence to do that to a stranger for no reason, I mean, that to me should be a mandatory prison sentence. There may well be some very rare circumstances where they've shown genuine remorse, where the victim has kind of made up with them, and there may be a situation there where maybe they can avoid a custodial sentence if it's genuine remorse. But the problem is with people who do that, they're very likely to do it again. Um, so when Timpson says that they said we're addicted to punishment, that sort of attitude makes me wonder what his ideology is. I don't think we're addicted to punishment in this country. I think far too often, actually, offenders get off on a community sentence. I mean, that's the sort of liberal left position that I really have a problem with because it demonstrates a lack of understanding as to what most victims of crime want to see. Victims of crime don't want revenge, they just want to see justice. They want to see the people who have hurt them held accountable. Now, the issue is what it is. None of this is going to be solved overnight, and I'm not suggesting there's a magic wand. I'm not suggesting, oh, just throw them in and throw away the key. For one thing, there literally isn't space. Now, during the campaign, Starmer spoke about 20,000 new prison spaces. That's a good policy. It's an absolutely sensible policy. Of course, it'll take time, but if they're on the path to doing that, good. What I don't want to hear now that they're in government is a softening of the attitude to crime. And oh well, the prisons are overcrowded, so we'll just release loads of people. Um, People who hurt society have to face consequences. I have a really big problem with the mindset that is anti-punishment. Punishment's part of justice. That's just the reality. It's part of justice. I don't believe you can have justice without punishment. Even more lenient punishment, it's still a form of punishment. Now, I think community sentences are arguably overused, but regardless, it's still a form of punishment. It's not fun. I think too many offenders laugh at it, but so I really question the mindset of someone who's anti-punishment. If you're anti-punishment, how can you say that you're pro-justice? So, I know that Starmer said he has confidence in this man. In fact, he said he was very pleased with that appointment. And Starmer, with his legal background, certainly does know something about the legal bureaucracy. Um, but frankly, he spoke tough during the campaign. Now he has to deliver. If Labour suddenly gets soft on crime, I'll be very angry and disappointed. It's not that I was kind of dewy eyed and thinking this would all change overnight. I actually think the problems are deeper than any one government. Of course, the Tories have failed to deliver, but I was never under the impression, okay, well, Labour's going to get all of this right. But because I think it goes deeper than any one party or any one government, I think it's actually the arrogance of the system, the detachment of the system. The court backlog thing is a big problem, but I think the issues with the justice system predate that. I think there's a detachment, there's an arrogance from the courts who are just detached from public opinion. I genuinely believe that. Um, so I appreciate that they literally can't just put everyone in prison, all serious offenders in prison. But there's been lots of things going around the idea of mini prisons, the idea of releasing non-violent people early. It may be necessary. I accept that. It's not great comfort to victims, but Alex Chalk had to do that as Justice Secretary. Um, Building new prison spaces probably makes more sense than building new prisons because building new spaces is less controversial than opening up a new prison. I mean, I favour new prisons, but I understand where a problem would lie. Whichever town it was in, locals would complain because no one wants to live near a prison. Um, but I would favour some sort of remote area, where they're well away from population. The thing about this issue, you know, I am hardline on crime. I make no apology for that. I am conservative on this issue. But the point about this is not just in favour of prison staff and victims of crime, it's actually in favour of inmates as well. Like I've said before, if you have four people in a cell designed for two, it's inevitably going to put more stress on them. It's going to make their prison time harder, and then it increases the likelihood of bitterness, then taken out on society when they're released, but also disorder within the prison system. So it makes absolute sense to ease that pressure. I'm 100% in favour of that. How should it be done? Building more prison spaces. I accept that in the short term, there may well be um, less serious offenders. I personally don't really believe that there's many people in prison who don't deserve to be there. I strongly disagree with Timpson on that because he's probably saying, oh, there's a lot of non-violent offences, but he's not factoring in what those non-violent offences are. Like I say, if you have a con artist who's robbed someone of their life savings, it may not involve physical violence, but they should definitely be in prison. If you have a serial offender, if you have someone who's got community sentence after community sentence, particularly young offenders, and they laugh at it, literally, is it really appropriate to just give them another community order? Clearly, that isn't working. The liberal left often talk about how prison doesn't work and punishment doesn't work, but can they can they say with certainty that community sentencing works? I'm not against it. I think if you have an offender who has genuine remorse and their offence isn't at the higher end of the scale, like say they're a shoplifter, and I'm not trivializing any crime, but it is, you do get different levels. Um, and they've shown genuine remorse and there's some sort of payback to the victim. Like, for example, if they happen to be on benefits, then a big chunk of that should go towards the victim. There should be a mechanism in place that the victim gets something back from that, rather than just, oh well, we're sorry you're a victim of this crime, but the offender's just going to clean a few gardens for a few hours. That isn't good enough. People might think I obsess about this issue of toughness and talking tough. I actually think it is very important. To me, it's more than sloganism. I think it demonstrates where ideology lies. And I do wonder about politicians who are reluctant to talk tough. Then they might say, oh, we're not going for simple sound bites, but I want to know what the ideology is. And I question anyone. So I'm questioning Timpson, who has a problem with the concept of punishment, because it demonstrates that they don't understand that that's what victims of crime want. And also, it's right. If you hurt society, you have to pay a price. That to me is simple fairness. Um, I think it's pretty nonsensical to argue otherwise, because it's all very well talking about rehabilitation, um, which is important after the fact, but there has to be punishment first. I don't see how you can rehabilitate someone if you're saying to them, well, you've done this terrible thing, but we're not going to punish you for that. Instead, we're going to, send you to a workshop or, um, you know, something like that. There has to be punishment. Punishment is absolutely 100% part of justice. And I take issue with anyone who says otherwise, because I think that their, their compasses on this is totally wrong. And maybe Timpson's had a big success with his initiative. Like I say, I'm not against it. What I want to know is what his view of those 2/3 supposedly who shouldn't be in prison. Let's just put that in context. The prison population um, of England and Wales is around 85,000. I think it's about 8,000 in Scotland. I'm not sure what the figure is in Northern Ireland. It's almost 100,000 people. Um, it's a lot of people. So if he's saying 2/3 should probably not be there. That means, in his opinion, only about 35,000 people should be in prison, which means 70,000 people currently in prison, in his view, shouldn't be there. Now, I do not believe this is people not paying their TV license. I mean, that shouldn't be a criminal offence at all. But in most cases, people are in prison for a reason. It's not like they're just thrown in without some sort of context. And I think most inmates probably do deserve to be there. I think Timpson's probably think, oh, they're non-violent. That's I'd like to know what his view on that is, i.e., in his opinion, what people shouldn't be in prison, and can he prove that the alternative worked? Because I'm not convinced that community sentencing does. His program, like I say, he's the CEO of Timpson, or the founder of the Timpson Tea Company. Um, if that's been successful, fine, but that might only work with a certain type of offender. As for intervention, this was also brought up in the press conference. Intervention for young offenders. Again, I'm not against it. It makes sense if you have a 15-year-old who's in with the wrong crowd, and they're constantly getting in trouble with police. It may be that a non-custodial sentence and intervention stage is important. But if you have a pack of 15-year-olds who beat someone to a pulp, they should absolutely go to prison. Not an adult prison, but they should absolutely be in a young offenders prison. This idea that young offenders should be treated with kid gloves, I honestly think one of the biggest problems with young offenders in this country is they are enabled by the softly, softly approach. Now, there'll be people who work with youth services and so on will disagree with me. They'll say, oh, punishment's punitive. But I say to them, are the young offenders you are working with, are they showing genuine remorse? I'm not convinced they are, because I've seen that from interviews, I've seen that from personal experience. They laugh at the system. In fact, they will boast about how many times they've been arrested. If you have someone with that sort of complacency, clearly there's not a deterrent. Now, Sunak's national service idea was widely scoffed, but I actually think there was something behind it. I just think it fell flat because of the timing. It looked desperate. Um, but I think there's something behind it. I do think that there should be, frankly, there needs to be tougher penalties for young offenders. The softly, softly approach does not work, because all that does is says to a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old thug, um, oh, well, you shouldn't do that again. Don't be so naughty. No, it's not a deterrent. And I know Labour is never going to go down like a scared straight approach or something like that. But I honestly think it's no reassurance to victims of crime to see ministers say, "Oh well, most people in prison shouldn't be there." Um, I think most victims of crime would disagree with that. I think they'd agree that the system is, overstretched, and it's an appalling situation where you have people waiting on the court backlog. Another thing that is a disgrace of the Tories, and Starmer was right to point this out, when you had the Conservative government actually directing the police not to arrest people, that is lamentable. I mean, this is why I have a problem with seeing any crime as trivial, because if you own a stall in, say, a market, I know Leeds city centre has been particularly plagued by this. Those small store owners have to constantly replenish the goods, where you have gangs of criminals coming in and taking it. Now, are those people deterred by a community sense? I'm not sure that they are. And yet, probably at this point, you can't send them to prison. But when more prison spaces are built, they should be sent to prison, where you have serial offenders. The issue to me with overcrowding isn't let's jail fewer people, it's let's build more spaces. And actually, in terms of cost, jailing fewer people isn't necessarily going to save cost because they're just going to reoffend. If they don't have an effective deterrent, they're going to reoffend anyway, which in the long term is going to be probably more costly than building new prison spaces. Now, crucially, Labour promises they said they would build 20,000 new prison spaces. If we were dealing with a Green Party, I would think that this is, it's a dark, dark situation. With Labour, I've a little bit of hope that they can be effective on this issue. I'm not convinced totally. I think that there is elements of Labour that is fundamentally ideologically soft on crime. I don't know about Starmer personally. I really don't know. He comes from a legal background. Famously, he was head of the CPS where he prosecuted terrorists. So he's certainly not on the, neoliberal wing of the party that would be softly, softly. He's also a pragmatist. But frankly, he was being populist during the campaign, being tough on crime, and he had those controversial posters of Sunak and the Tories being soft on crime, basically. Now, now people might say it's cynical, but I think okay, well that shows that Starmer's willing to go in an ideological direction. Now, if he does a U-turn and his government suddenly gets soft on crime, I'll be very angry about that because people like me, I'm not saying it's the reason I voted Labour. I voted Labour because the local candidate was, seemed plausible and he was frankly the most active here. Um, but yeah, I think ideology is extremely important. And like I say, I question anyone who has a problem with the principle of punishment. It's not punitive. It does serve a purpose. It's holding criminals to account. So if you have someone saying, okay, the criminal's committed this awful offence, but let's just rehabilitate them. Let's just teach them some skills and hope for the best. And it might even be effective, right? But what is important is not only what's effective, which is vital, obviously. It's also about the perception and the reality. The people who are society are held to account. That's a basic principle. It has to be central to this. So if you think that punishment isn't part of justice, that's delusional. And it really makes me question people who come out with that because it makes me think, okay, you don't understand what most victims of crime want. I'm not speaking for everyone. You'll have some victims of crime who just happen to be more on the liberal left of things. But I think most victims of crime want to see the people who've done it to them held to account. And you can't hold people to account without punishment, some form of punishment. It's just part of it. It's absolutely part of justice. Um, and I will fiercely argue against anyone who says otherwise because I think it's delusional to say this person's hurt society, but let's not punish them. Then that's punitive. Let's just rehabilitate them. Let's just say, oh, you need to do this course or something. As opposed to the offender, that might be some form of punishment, but it's also about proportionality, right? So getting onto some sort of training course or a community sentence, the offender may not like that. They may find it boring or tedious or whatever, but the victim will say, well, wait a second. They've assaulted me. They've caused me fear from leaving my own home. Um, and they're getting a tap on the wrist. That's how many victims will see it. So I think I mean, Timpson's not a senior minister. Prisons Minister is. I don't think it's a cabinet position, but it does demonstrate an ideology. Labour spoke tough. They have to deliver now. Building new prison spaces over time. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's so important. Tony Blair's government delivered to some extent. Violent crime did drop. The Tories got some things right, like I say, Dominic Raab as Justice Secretary gave victims a greater say in parole hearings. That's very important. There was more transparency in sentencing verdicts. Labour isn't going to overturn that stuff, but there's so much more to do. The court's backlog is vital. The prison's overcrowding issue is vital. But I also think the ideology is vital. And this government must show the victims of crime that they're on their side and not on the side of offenders. That means saying to offenders, you're going to be held to account for what you've done. Um, Not sell, please change. You know, we're going to put you in this education course, so hope for the best. Please change. Please don't do that. I don't believe in negotiating with criminals. I think if they've done something, if they've hurt society, and proven, there's one last thing. Each case is unique. There will be specific circumstances in specific cases, which always has to be factored in. I think the Sentencing Council needs to drag itself into the real world. I think the courts need to drag themselves into the real world when it comes to sentencing. Of course, judges will say our hands are tied because we don't want to put more prisoners into the system because it's overcrowded. Um, in all of this, victims arguably get ignored. Um, I accept like all the big issues of the day. There's no quick fix to this, but what I am very, very, very interested in is what is the ideology of this Labour government? Are they, to put it bluntly, are they soft on crime, or do they recognise that criminals have to pay a price? And of course, they want to reduce crime. Every government does, but the ideology is extremely important. And Timpson isn't sending out a good message, in my opinion. Is saying two-thirds of criminals shouldn't, who are in prison, shouldn't be there. No, I disagree with that thoroughly. Um, you know, people who are in prison that shouldn't be there are people who haven't paid a TV license, but that's probably an extremely small fraction of those who are. I suspect the vast majority of people who are in prison do deserve to be there. And again, just because it hasn't involved violence doesn't mean it's a trivial crime.